What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today we're going to be looking at some supposed sources for a historical Jesus. This guy in this video that I promised that I would be doing these multiple parts on, he's got a lot of different sources that we're going to go through today, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at him reciting the sources and telling us what and what he says they say, and then we're going to look at what he draws from that source as to being historical fact. So we're going to be looking at this today. If you're interested in the historical evidence for Jesus, then please stay tuned. So, there are a lot of common sources that are cited when people want to prove that Jesus existed in history. When they present these sources, they only really take a prima facie look at the evidence, meaning they only take a surface level look at the evidence, and they claim that it proves a historical Jesus without looking any deeper into the source. This guy is going to be doing nothing more than that, taking a very surface level look at these supposed sources for the historical Jesus and, trying to glean historical information from them. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each of his claims and then really dive deep into the historical context as well as possible interpolations surrounding each source. First, we're going to start off with this one.
Okay, number one, a guy named Tacitus. He was an historian who wrote around 100 AD. Here's something he had to say. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular.
So, first of all, he's changed some things about Tacitus here. Even if we take this passage at face value, all it does is regurgitate what Christians were thinking in the 2nd century and putting them down and blaming the Christians for the burning of Rome. That's all it does. It just says, hey, Christians existed in 64 AD when Rome burned. That's the most that we can historically gather from this, even if we take it at face value. This obviously doesn't support a historical Jesus because it is just regurgitating common beliefs of Christians during the 2nd century. He doesn't cite any kind of sources for this information, so there's no way for us to determine if he got it from eyewitness accounts or if it's just the general Christian population, which more than likely, as we'll see, it was just the general Christian population that more likely influenced him in writing this. We can say this with a pretty good level of certainty because he had regular communication with Pliny the Younger. We'll get to that here in a little bit in the problems surrounding Pliny the Younger, but I do want to make the case that this particular passage is interpolated. First of all, he doesn't say Christians, he says Christians, and this has been forensically proven using different methods to determine what was originally written down. And what was originally written down is Christians. This makes a lot of sense because Christos was not a name, it was a title, whereas Christus is actually a name. Suetonius also supports this particular interpretation of it because he reports on a Christus causing a lot of problems in Rome in 49 AD, and so it's obvious that there at least was a dickhead running around called Christus that was causing problems. Now, I want to go back to Pliny the Younger. Remember how I said that he is most likely the person that informed Tacitus about Christians and Christian beliefs. Pliny the Younger, even though he had a very wide-ranging set of duties in the Roman government, he had never heard of Christians before. Now, this is especially surprising when you consider who his father was, his adoptive father, his uncle, Pliny the Elder. Now, you see, Pliny the Elder wrote summaries on history from the years of in the 30s all the way up to when he died in the 70s, 79 AD. That's when Vesuvius erupted, and he was actually killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Pliny the Younger extensively read the works of his father, Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder, as far as we know, doesn't mention Christians, their beliefs, their faith, or anything like that whatsoever, but especially during the burning of Rome. Now, Suetonius does reference Christians, but not in the context of the burning of Rome. To add on to this, Cassius Dio, another historian in the 1st or 2nd century, he also doesn't report the Christians being blamed by Nero for the burning of Rome. In fact, nobody other than Tacitus reports the Christians as being responsible, or at least blamed, by Nero for the burning of Rome. Tacitus isn't referenced in this context at all until about the 4th century, when the aspiring Harry Potter dark arts teacher Sulpicius Severus mentions him. Now, I know this is an argument from silence, but an argument from silence isn't fallacious if you have good reason to expect people to report on something. And we should expect at least other historians to report Nero blaming the Christians for the burning of Rome. If we are to take it as being a historical account of anything, we would expect these other writers who wrote about the burning of Rome, who, described the burning of Rome and everything like that, we would expect these people to actually mention that Nero was blaming the Christians, but we just simply don't find it. And we don't find it until the 4th century. So I believe this passage meets the criteria for an argument from silence, because we should expect to find other historians reporting this. Also, this is not a fringe position. There are some people out there that will call it a fringe position, but it's not. There are at least 7 scholars right now that support this position. Now, normally I would call that like an argument from authority or whatnot, but I believe that it's the evidence that supports the position and not the number of scholars that support it. All in all, this source for Jesus isn't as clear-cut as he would want you to think. At best, it only says that Christians existed in the 64 AD when Rome burned. That's it. At worst, it didn't even exist when Tacitus originally wrote this particular section. And he was actually referencing Crestus when he was writing before.
With each of these accounts that I'm going to read to you, I'm going to point out what things we can glean about the story of Jesus in the early church. In this, we see that Jesus was executed, that happened during the reign of Tiberius. We see that Christianity found its origins in Judea, and that it was significant enough to be pushed back upon during the reign of Nero, which was in the 60s AD.
None of that is different from just common Christian theology of the 2nd century. Tacitus doesn't list any kind of source for his information. There are 2 possible explanations for this particular section. Either he got his information from Pliny the Younger, or it's a heavily interpolated passage. Either way you go about it, you do not end up with a historical reference to Jesus. It's just a mere regurgitation of 2nd century Christian theology. Because one thing that you have to understand is the order in which the books of the New Testament were written. First you have Paul that was writing in the 50s. And, he doesn't mention Tiberius, he doesn't mention Pilate, he doesn't mention any of the things that Tacitus mentions. We only find those particular elements appearing in the Gospels. Now, Mark was written in the 70s AD, and then with Matthew and Luke coming after that in the 80s and then the 90s, and then John being written most likely in the 2nd century. You have to understand, Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, would have already had Paul and Mark and Matthew, at least, to have been writing off of, if not also Luke. So this information is no different than what Christians would have already been believing at the time. Christians would have already believed that Pilate executed Jesus. They would have already believed that it was during the time of Tiberius. So it doesn't actually support the position that this is referencing a historical Jesus when Christians at the time already believed Jesus to have existed in history. If you'd like to read more about Tacitus and why it doesn't actually support a historical Jesus, I suggest getting Robert Van Voorst's book, Jesus Outside the New Testament. It provides a lot of good scholarly looks at external sources for Jesus, and he's actually a Christian, so he is faltering sometimes in some of these parts of it, but he's ultimately a really good source to go to if you want a somewhat objective look at these sources. All right, what's your next source there, bud?
Number 2, a guy named Lucian, a mid-1st century Greek author, said this: "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they're all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property."
So Lucian of Samosata is a satirist that was writing in the mid-2nd century. The quote that he just read off was from his book, The Death of Peregrinus, that was written about 165 AD. This obviously is not a historical reference to Jesus. Again, this is a regurgitation of common Christian beliefs in the 2nd century. First, you have to consider the time at which it was written. Since it was written in 165, we know that pretty much all of the Gospels and all of Paul's writings were available to people in the Christian community. And so the Christian community would have represented what they already believed. Lucian could be using some kind of extant eyewitness source that he had at the time. Considering that he doesn't cite any sources like that, there's no reason to think that he had eyewitness sources. Also, him writing in 165 doesn't rule him out necessarily, because he could have these extant eyewitness sources. But like I said, he doesn't cite any eyewitness source, so there's no reason to think that he had eyewitness sources. Considering that he's not citing any kind of extant eyewitness source that he might have or anything like that, there's no reason to consider him an independent account of a historical Jesus. Again, if you want to learn more about this, you can see Robert Van Voorst. He would back me up on the idea that Lucian isn't a first-hand or even second-hand or any kind of source for a historical Jesus. He even goes as far as to say that, the stuff that Lucian gets right in his book is just common knowledge at that time. So go definitely read Van Voorst's book. All right, well, let's see what kind of historical information this guy can glean from Lucian.
Okay, there's a ton there that sounds a whole lot like what we're seeing in Luke and Acts. Christians worship Jesus as God. They believe in eternal life. They're brave in the face of persecution. They count themselves as brothers and sisters. They only worship one God. Jesus was crucified, and they held their property in common, apparently meeting the needs of the poor. Those are 7 details that provide, in and of themselves, a pretty solid framework for what this whole story is about.
Yes, by this point, the Gospel of Luke would have been well known in the Christian community. It would have been part of their basic theology. You see, what we know of as the canon books of the Bible were most likely put together in the 2nd century, even though they weren't solidified until later. The collection of books that we know of as the New Testament would have already been in place by the 2nd century. So all of the information that's regurgitated here by Lucian would have been common knowledge to a Christian community. There's no reason to think that it's any kind of independent source that was informing Lucian about the Christians. At best, Lucian can confirm some historical facts about what Christians believed in the 2nd century, but really that's about as much as we can hope to glean from Lucian. The Gospels are not historical accounts. And even if they were, it doesn't help out Lucian that he was influenced, whether indirectly or directly, by the Gospels. All right, so what's your third source there, bud?
A third author, Suetonius, who I mentioned earlier, wrote around 100 AD. He was a biographer of Claudius. He was a Roman, and it's a brief mention, but he says this: "As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome."
No, Suetonius doesn't say Christus. He says Chrestus. You're obviously reading off of some kind of prepared statement that an apologist put together that lists off what they supposedly said, all of these sources, because you seem to be changing key components of what these sources say in order to fit your narrative. Anyways, this is a reference to a Jewish rebel that was causing problems, or maybe not even a Jewish rebel or something like that, but just a rebel named Chrestus that was causing problems. Claudius expelled his ass from Rome for being an instigator. See, the instigator part of it kind of gives you the indication that we're not talking about Jesus or anything that died in the 30s. We're talking about somebody that was physically there instigating things in Rome, at least enough for Claudius to tell him to get the fuck out. And I mean, so you can't use Suetonius to say that there's a reference to a historical Jesus, because even Paul has Jesus being dead in the 30s. All Suetonius has is a rebel named Chrestus in 49 AD causing a bunch of shit and getting thrown out. So no, this is not a historical reference to Christ or even Christians.
Presumably this Chrestus is Christ, but it certainly matches up with the timeline and indicates a brief Claudian persecution because he misunderstood the relationship between Christianity and the Jews.
How does this match up with the Christian timeline exactly? I really don't understand why you would think that this matches up with any kind of Christian theology, so I'm genuinely interested into why you think this. I mean, this particular passage has it happening at least 16 years after Jesus supposedly died. Again, it's also not Christus, it's Chrestus. There are some apologists and New Testament scholars out there that would put forth that the Chrestus is actually just a misspelling of Christus, or Christians is a misspelling of Christians, because of how the I and the E are formulated in Greek. But I don't really see any kind of evidence that would directly suggest this, because Suetonius goes on later to correctly report Christians, Christianos, in his works. So he obviously knows how to spell it. I don't think that it was like a mistake by Suetonius. There's nothing to actually suggest that particular explanation. So all in all, Suetonius doesn't mention Christians or Christ or Jesus or anything like that in this particular passage. So this can't be used to gain any kind of historical knowledge about Jesus of the New Testament. All right, let's go on ahead and let's get to this fourth source that you got.
Fourth, a guy named Thallus. Thallus apparently wrote in the mid-1st century, but we don't have any actual copies of his manuscripts. Instead, we can figure out that he wrote a book because a whole bunch of other people quote him in their works that do still exist. Thallus was interested in the natural world and observed a strange phenomenon that he recorded. Here's a quote of Thallus from the 1st century AD. On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So later authors recorded this guy having said, there was weird earthquake and an unpredicted eclipse that shouldn't have happened at the time that it happened.
Wait a second. You need to finish the quote here by Thallus. You'll understand why he doesn't finish the quote. Here it is. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day, reckoning by the lunar calendar, and the events concurring the Savior all occurred before the first day of the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun happens when the moon creeps under the sun, and this is impossible at any other time but between the first day of the moon's waxing and the day before that, when the new moon begins. So how are we to believe that an eclipse happened when the moon was diametrically opposite the sun? So this particular passage is a little difficult to quote because it's like third-hand information. For one, it's an actual quote by George Syncellus, who is quoting Julius Africanus, who is in turn quoting Thallus. So Thallus, we don't have any extant like manuscripts or any kind of thing like that. All we have is like third-hand referenced information. Although I will say that this could be still considered valid historical reference to a Jesus, if that's even what it was supposed to mention. Because you see, even Julius Africanus knew that the whole eclipse and earthquake thing, I mean, that was really kind of a ridiculous thing to believe. Even all the way back then, they knew that it was kind of bullshit to consider Thallus to be quoting something about Jesus. More importantly, though, Thallus never attaches the eclipse or the earthquake or anything like that to, like, Jesus. He never mentions it in the context of anything that could be considered related to Christ or Jesus or Christians. Another big thing that works against this particular source is the fact that Paul never mentions these things happening. So these claims being made about 40 plus years after they supposedly happened seems a lot more like myth-making or legendary accretion rather than actual historical references. The only earthquakes that happened in that area between 26 and 36 CE were so minor that they didn't give any kind of visual indication that they happened. In fact, the last earthquake that had that kind of significant visual effect on the area happened about 100 years earlier. Now, this quote of Thallus's seems to date to about the mid-2nd century. This comes from the fact that pagans weren't referencing anything from the Gospels prior to the 2nd century. So it would seem that Thallus falls into this category as well. So basically, the source of Thallus can't be used to date anything for Jesus historically because he never attaches these events to be happening around the time of Jesus. And even Julius Africanus knew that the claim of, Thallus, saying that this thing happened around the crucifixion of Jesus couldn't possibly be an explanation.
Obviously, all of this stuff lines up with the account of the crucifixion and some of the natural phenomena that occurred at that moment.
Our earliest account of the crucifixion would have been Paul, and he never mentions the sun going dark or an earthquake happening. He doesn't mention any of this. In fact, our earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't even record these particular things happening. All Mark does is record the temple curtain tearing, and that was more of a symbolic event that shows that Jesus destroyed the temple tradition, and he established his own tradition. So that was the symbolism surrounding that, but that doesn't involve an earthquake or even this magical eclipse. So what I'm trying to say is that this is not history. This is fiction. And we know that Matthew and Luke can't be more historical than Mark because not only do they come after Mark was written, but they used Mark in order to generate their own story about Jesus. So considering that they used Mark, they copied Mark, sometimes even directly copied Mark, they can't be considered an independent source. And in historiography, you want to use your earliest source as being representative of what most likely happened. In the case of the Gospels, that would be Mark, and Mark doesn't record the eclipse or the earthquake. So no, in this context, neither of these things line up with the historical evidence, supposedly the historical narrative of Jesus. All right. Now, what's our fifth and final source that you have for us today?
But wait, there's more. Number 5, a guy named Pliny. Sometimes you'll hear it said Pliny. I don't know, whichever. Say whatever you want. The guy who I'm going to call Pliny was a representative of the emperor who worked in modern-day Turkey. And one of his tasks was to get to the bottom of what the deal was with this Christian religion and to execute a persecution that was to be carried out against them. He wrote back to the Emperor Trajan the following report. They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. He goes on in another letter. I asked them directly if they were Christians. Those who persisted I ordered away. Those who denied they were or ever had been Christians worshipped both your image and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They used to gather on a stated day before dawn and sing to Christ as if he were a god. All the more I believed it necessary to find out what was the truth from 2 servant maids which were called deaconesses by means of torture. Nothing more did I find than a disgusting fanatical superstition. Therefore I stopped the examination and hastened to consult you on account of the number of people endangered. For many of all ages, all classes, and both sexes already are brought into danger.
Again, Pliny just accounts for Christians being in existence in the 2nd century. Pliny just regurgitates what Christians believed at the time. That's pretty much all you can say. If you were trying to make the case for what Christians believed in the 2nd century, then you would have a fine source for that. But you don't. You just simply don't have a source to solidify Jesus in history. And on a closer look, Pliny the Younger should really already know about Christians because of his father, Pliny the Elder, and because Pliny the Younger was an avid reader of his father. So if his father had encountered Christians, then Pliny would know about them. But you see, Pliny doesn't know about them. So obviously Pliny the Elder didn't encounter them or write about them or anything like that. They weren't significant enough for him to write about him. And, if Jesus had existed, Pliny the Elder is the one that we would expect to know something about, Christ or Jesus or anything like that. He would be one of those authors that we would expect to see him writing about this Jesus character. And we just simply don't. we don't see him mentioning Christ at all. So I would say at worst, this is evidence against the historicity of Jesus, but at best, it is just evidence for what Christians believed in the 2nd century.
There's a ton going on here, and this is coming from a hostile source, but you got to admit the Christians come off looking pretty dang good in this account. From Pliny's correspondence with Trajan, we can deduce then that Christians met weekly, that they sang songs about God, that they viewed Jesus as God, that they had a code of Christian morality based on the teachings of Christ, that they met each other's needs, that they were evangelistic, and that they were persecuted by Rome. So there's 7 more things that give us a sense of what the church looks like, and if you've been with me on this Acts thing, that sounds just like what we're seeing in Luke's account.
Well, yeah. It sounds like that because Christians in the 2nd century would have gotten their information from the Gospels, or rather people that were, using the Gospels in order to teach Christian theology. And Pliny the Younger was just regurgitating what he heard the Christians confessing to while he was interrogating. And again, this isn't proof for any kind of historical nature about Jesus. It's just proof about what Christians believed at the time. And that time being the 2nd century, which would also mean that it's not the 1st century. Well, heathens, that's it for today on this one. We only went through 5 of his sources today. He has some more that are going to be coming up, but I, just wanted to segment this out into easily digestible portions. So all you get was the 5 best sources that he could, I guess, first mention right here, and then we're going to be getting into some more stuff later. Next time, we're going to be covering the Talmud as well as Marbar Serapion, which I've already mentioned here on the channel, but we'll cover again next week. So if you're interested in any of that, then make sure you smash that like button and subscribe down below. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.